West Caribbean Airways Flight 708, a McDonnell Douglas MD-82, took off from Tocumen International Airport in Panama City on August 16, 2005. It was a charter flight, carrying 152 passengers and 8 crew members, most of them tourists from Martinique, returning home after a vacation. The crew was experienced, and the aircraft was maintained as per industry standards. The flight was scheduled to land at Fort-de-France, Martinique, after a short, uneventful journey. The weather was partially cloudy, with reports of mild turbulence along the route. Inside the cockpit, Captain Eduardo Chavez and First Officer Francisco Ochoa went through their standard procedures. The takeoff was smooth, the climb was steady, and everything seemed routine. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, ensuring that passengers were comfortable. Many were relaxing, chatting, or gazing out of the windows as the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 31,000 feet. But unknown to everyone on board, a deadly sequence of misjudgments and overlooked warnings had already begun. As Flight 708 climbed higher, the aircraft entered an area of unusual weather conditions. The outside temperature was below freezing, and ice crystals began forming on the aircraft's wings. This type of ice buildup, known as airframe icing, is dangerous because it disrupts the flow of air over the wings, reducing lift and increasing the risk of a stall. However, inside the cockpit, the pilots were unaware of the growing danger. The aircraft's pitot static system, responsible for measuring airspeed, began giving inaccurate readings. The pilots noticed a drop in airspeed, but assumed it was a normal variation due to the weather. They decided to increase the aircraft's altitude to 33,000 feet, believing this would get them above the turbulence. This was a fatal mistake. The higher the aircraft climbed, the thinner the air became, making it even harder for the wings to generate lift. The pilots had unknowingly put their aircraft into a high-altitude stall scenario, one that would soon become irreversible. At 33,000 feet, the aircraft's airspeed continued to drop, but the engines were still running smoothly. The pilots did not realize that they were already on the verge of a deep aerodynamic stall. Suddenly, the cockpit stick shaker activated, an urgent warning that the aircraft was losing lift and was about to stall. "Stall! Stall!" the warning system blared. Captain Chavez and First Officer Ochoa were caught off guard. They instinctively pulled back on the controls, trying to lift the nose of the aircraft. But this was the worst possible reaction. Instead of regaining speed, their actions caused the plane to lose even more lift, worsening the stall. The aircraft lurched violently, the nose pitching upward, then suddenly dropping downward. Passengers in the cabin screamed as they felt the plane tilting unnaturally. Flight attendants struggled to maintain their balance as the aircraft shuddered. In the cockpit, the pilots fought desperately, pushing the engines to full power. But, at this altitude, the engines could not generate enough thrust to escape the stall. The aircraft began falling, fast. The MD-82, now fully stalled, plunged nose first toward the earth at over 7,000 feet per minute. The Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, blared warnings. "Terrain, terrain, pull up." But the aircraft was no longer responding. The pilots frantically attempted to regain control, but their earlier mistake, pulling back instead of pushing forward, had made recovery nearly impossible. In the cabin, the horror was unimaginable. Some passengers prayed, others held onto their loved ones, and some simply froze in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. The sudden drop caused zero-gravity effects, with loose objects floating momentarily before slamming back down. "We're going down! We're going down!" One flight attendant screamed as she tried to help passengers brace for impact. The cockpit voice recorder, CVR, captured the final, desperate attempts by the pilots. Chavez: power up, try again." Ochoa: no response, we're still falling." GPWS: terrain, pull up. The aircraft, still in a deep stall, had now fallen below 15,000 feet, and there was nothing but mountainous terrain below. At 7:45 a.m., after just 3 minutes of uncontrolled descent, Flight 708 crashed into a remote mountainous region in western Venezuela, disintegrating on impact. The force of the crash was so powerful that it instantly killed all 160 people on board. 6. Wreckage was scattered across a vast area, making rescue efforts nearly impossible. Local villagers, the first to reach the scene, described the devastation as total and absolute. There were no survivors. In the days that followed, investigators retrieved the black boxes and began piecing together the deadly chain of events. The final conclusion was clear. The aircraft stalled due to ice buildup, but the pilots failed to recognize the stall. Instead of executing the correct nose-down recovery, they pulled back, sealing their fate. Lack of proper stall recovery training and misinterpretation of cockpit alerts contributed to the disaster. The tragedy of West Caribbean Airways Flight 708 led to major changes in pilot training, ensuring that pilots were better equipped to handle high-altitude stalls. But for the 160 people on board, these changes came too late. Flight 708 had fallen through the sky, completely powerless to stop its fate. The crash of West Caribbean Airways. Flight 708 sent shockwaves through Martinique, Venezuela, and the entire aviation world. Families who had expected to reunite with their loved ones were instead met with the unimaginable news that there were no survivors. At Martinique's airport, relatives who had gathered to welcome home friends and family collapsed in grief when officials confirmed the worst. Television cameras captured scenes of sorrow, with people screaming, fainting, and clinging to each other as the heartbreaking reality set in. National mourning was declared in Martinique, with candlelight vigils held in churches and public squares. The island, small and close-knit, was devastated. Almost everyone knew someone on board Flight 708. In Venezuela, recovery efforts were difficult and heartbreaking. The dense jungle and mountainous terrain made reaching the crash site challenging. But despite the devastation, teams worked tirelessly to recover the remains of passengers and the aircraft's black boxes. As soon as the black boxes were recovered, investigators from Venezuela's Civil Aviation Authority, France's BEA, and the U.S. NTSB launched an extensive probe into what exactly happened to Flight 708. The Flight Data Recorder, FDR, and Cockpit Voice Recorder, CVR, were badly damaged, but still held crucial data. When investigators analyzed the recordings, they were horrified by what they found. The aircraft had stalled for over 3 minutes, completely out of control, while the pilots struggled in confusion. The chilling final words from the cockpit revealed desperation. "Captain Chavez, why isn't it responding?" First Officer Ochoa. "We're falling too fast. It's not climbing." GPWS. Alarm. "Terrain. Terrain. Pull up." Captain Chavez. Last transmission. "Madre de Dios." Mother of God. The data confirmed that the pilots had unknowingly stalled the plane and made incorrect recovery inputs, sealing the aircraft's fate. The accident was a wake-up call for the aviation industry. It revealed serious gaps in high altitude, stall recovery training, particularly for pilots flying older generation aircraft like the MD-82. The investigation led to several major reforms, improved stall recovery training. Airlines worldwide introduced mandatory simulator training focused on recognizing and recovering from stalls at high altitudes. Better ice detection systems. Flight 708's initial issue stemmed from undetected ice accumulation. Newer aircraft now feature enhanced wing and pitot tube anti-icing technology. Pilot education on high-altitude performance. Many pilots at the time were trained primarily for low-altitude stall recovery. After Flight 708, high-altitude stalls became a critical part of pilot education. West Caribbean Airways, already struggling financially before the crash, ceased operations within months due to loss of trust and mounting lawsuits. The accident was a wake-up call for the aviation industry. It revealed serious gaps in high-altitude stall recovery training, particularly for pilots flying older generation aircraft like the MD-82. The investigation led to several major reforms. Improved stall recovery training. Airlines worldwide introduced mandatory simulator training focused on recognizing and recovering from stalls at high altitudes. Better ice detection systems. Flight 708's initial issue stemmed from undetected ice accumulation. Newer aircraft. Feature enhanced wing and pitot tube anti-icing technology. Pilot education on high-altitude performance. Many pilots at the time were trained primarily for low-altitude stall recovery. After Flight 708, high-altitude stalls became a critical part of pilot education. West Caribbean Airways, already struggling financially before the crash, ceased operations within months due to loss of trust and mounting lawsuits. For the families of the victims, answers weren't enough. They wanted justice. Many accused West Caribbean Airways of negligence, pointing out its financial troubles, questionable maintenance practices, and lack of proper pilot training. Lawsuits were filed against West Caribbean Airways for poor pilot training and operational mismanagement. McDonnell Douglas Boeing for the MD-82's vulnerability to high-altitude stalls. Various regulatory agencies for failing to enforce better safety training. While the airline was already on the brink of bankruptcy, settlements were reached for many of the victims' families, providing some form of closure. But for the people of Martinique, the scars of this tragedy would never heal. Today, the lessons from West Caribbean Airways Flight 708 continue to shape modern aviation safety. The crash remains one of the deadliest accidents involving an MD-82 and serves as a case study in improper stall recovery procedures. The victims of Flight 708 are not forgotten. Each year, on August 16th, families gather at a memorial in Martinique, where the names of all 160 victims are engraved. The aviation industry learned from their loss, ensuring that pilots today are better equipped to recognize and handle stalls at high altitudes. Though the aircraft fell through the sky, its impact on the world of aviation helped prevent future tragedies.